The Vorok nutritional officer's name was Presenthal, and she had a way of looking at my food like it had personally insulted her extended family. She'd stand at the service window, 6 feet of pale, silver-ridged Vorak officer. Her assessment tablet held at precisely the angle of someone who had already made up their mind. And she would watch me plate up. Just watch. The way you watch a child draw on the wall with crayon. Patient, faintly sad, already composing the report in her head. I'd been aboard the V's contemplation of distant stars for 14 weeks at that point. The exchange program was 6 months total. A Vorok nutritional observer embedded at the Human Joint Fleet Station on Reach 7. Me aboard this vessel, and the paperwork described my role as culinary liaison and dietary bridge representative. What that meant in practice was, I ran the galley that fed the 31 humans embedded with the Vorok exchange cohort, and I had a standing invitation to also provide supplementary rations to any Vorok crew who expressed an interest in human food. As of week 1, no Vorok had expressed an interest in human food. As of week 14, 47 Vorok were coming through my line every meal service, not because they'd decided they liked it, because Presenthal had ordered them to. Something about baseline sampling for her audit. I wasn't consulted. I just cooked. My name is Gus Farron. I'm 43 years old, originally from a stretch of coastal New South Wales that you've never heard of. And before the exchange program, I ran the galley aboard the survey tender Aldgate Cross for 11 years. Before that, 2 years cooking for a road crew in the Pilbara. Before that, 18 months in a pub kitchen in Wollongong that I don't like to think about. Not because anything terrible happened there, but because I was 22 and made the kind of decisions that 22-year-olds make when they have access to a commercial kitchen and friends who work until midnight. I am not a complicated man. I know how to feed people. I know how to manage a store's manifest. And I know how to stay out of the way of people with authority and opinions. These 3 skills had gotten me through 43 years without notable incident, and I saw no reason that a Vorok fleet vessel should be any different. Presenthal had other ideas, though not the kind she intended. She came to me in week 3, formally, with her tablet, which I had already learned meant this was going on record, and she explained in her precise, slightly too careful standard that she had completed a preliminary spectral analysis of my menu items and found them to be, and I'm quoting from memory here, biochemically inert with respect to Vorok metabolic requirements. I said, right. She looked at me the way she looked at my food. You understand what that means. It means your lot can't get nutrition from what I cook. Correct. The compounds present in your food items are not recognized by Vorok digestive biochemistry as nutritive inputs. They pass through without integration. You are feeding your human colleagues adequately. I have no concern there. But the supplementary rations being provided to Vorok crew members are, from a nutritional standpoint, functionally equivalent to consuming inert filler material. Decorative, I said. That is a reasonable summary, yes. I looked at her. She looked back at me with the expression of someone being very professional about a mildly disappointing situation. She had good posture, Presenthal. The kind of posture that comes from actually caring about how you present yourself rather than from being told to care. Her uniform was perfectly maintained. Her tablet had a small organizational tag on the upper corner. She was, I had already decided, extremely competent, and she had decided with equal confidence that I was irrelevant. All right, I said. Anything else? She seemed slightly thrown by this. She'd come prepared for defensiveness, probably. Some human galley cook, getting his back up about the quality of his cooking. I will be filing a supplementary note to the program coordinator indicating that Vorok crew participation in your meal service should be considered observational rather than nutritive. That's fine. The food itself it is not unpleasant, she said, which I think was meant to be kind, or at least professional. Several crew members have noted the experience as novel. There are texture compounds and aromatic profiles not present in standard Vorok fleet rations. The sensory experience appears to register as pleasant to most crew members who participated in the sampling. Glad to hear it. She left. I went back to prepping the dinner service. The galley was a good one by fleet support vessel standards. The Varrock had given me a proper space, 2 long prep counters in a pale composite material that cleaned easily, a dry stores area that was larger than what I'd had on the Aldgate Cross, refrigerated compartments calibrated to human food temperatures. After a brief negotiation with the ship's environmental systems officer, a functional oven which I'd been pleasantly surprised by, the Varrock didn't bake. But the oven was there as part of the standard equipment manifest, because some previous iteration of the exchange program had established it as a required human accommodation. The oven was the most important thing in the room, as far as I was concerned. I want to explain what I was cooking because it matters later. Human beings have a long and irritating history of surviving on things we probably shouldn't be able to survive on. This is not a point of pride. It's just a fact of our particular evolutionary history. We are generalist omnivores with a digestive system that is basically a slightly aggressive chemical processing plant. And over the course of however many thousands of years we've been doing this, we have developed an extremely complicated relationship with a range of compounds, fermented products, aged materials, and processed foods that would make a lot of species' nutritional boards deeply uncomfortable if they thought about it too hard. I cooked the way I'd always cooked. Galley food, practical, filling, built around shelf-stable ingredients and dried goods and the occasional fresh item when supply manifests allowed. I made a lot of grain-based dishes because grain kept well and cooked down reliably, and I'd learned to do a lot with it. I made fermented condiments because I'd been making them since the Pilbara, where shelf life was everything and fresh food was a rumor. I brewed a mild grain-based drink that the humans on the exchange called adequate beer and that I called Tuesday because that was when I usually made it. I made bread twice a week, Thursday and Sunday, which was an arbitrary schedule I'd set on the Aldgate Cross and never had a reason to change. Because fresh bread does something to morale that no amount of nutritional optimization can replicate, and morale on a long deployment is a logistical concern just as real as protein ratios. I seasoned everything by taste and smell and the judgment of a man who had been doing this for 20-odd years. I had 2 fermentation crocks in the dry stores area. One had been with me since the Pilbara, a koi culture I'd started from a commercial spore kit in year 1 and maintained continuously since, fed and turned and coaxed through 11 years of survey tenders and road stations and one very difficult period in shared housing that I don't discuss at length. The koi went into a paste that I used as a base seasoning for the protein dishes, a savory, complex thing that I'd started making because I ran out of everything else once and had discovered that fermenting what you had was better than not seasoning at all. The other crock was a sourdough starter I'd gotten from a baker in Fremantle 6 years ago when the Aldgate Cross docked there for an extended refit. Her name was Elaine. She'd given me a jar of starter and a handwritten set of notes about what to feed it and how often, and I'd been maintaining it since. The bread I made with it was good bread, not fancy, not the kind of bread people make documentaries about, but the kind of bread that fills a galley with smell and makes the people eating it feel, briefly and reliably, that they are somewhere they belong. These were the things I'd brought aboard contemplation of distant stars. These were the things Pressenthal had assessed as decorative. I should mention what the weeks between week 3 and the audit actually looked like, because they were the part nobody documented. The exchange program had a rhythm. The 31 humans in the cohort had their duties, most of them specialist roles that the exchange coordinators had matched to Varrock needs. An engineer here, a medic there, 2 xenobiological researchers who spent most of their time in the Varrock science section and came to the galley looking wrung out and slightly dazzled in equal measure. I cooked for them. That was my function. The Varrock fed me and gave me a bunk and gave my galley its power allocation. and I fed the human cohort 3 meals a day. And this was, according to the program paperwork, the sum of my contribution. What the paperwork did not account for was the window. The service window in my galley looked out into a corridor that connected the crew rest section to the secondary operations deck. It was a well-trafficked corridor. A lot of Vorok crew moved through it on their shift transitions. And because my service times aligned with those transitions, there was a period at each meal service when the window had an audience. Not intentionally, I wasn't performing. I was just cooking with the window open because the oven ran hot and the ventilation in the galley was functional but not generous, and the window being open helped. The smell came with it, obviously. That's just physics. By week 4, a few Vorok crew members who passed the window had started slowing down. Not stopping, they had places to be. Just a fractional reduction in pace. A slight orientation toward the window. The way warm-blooded creatures of most species tend to orient toward heat and smell without deciding to. By week 5, 2 of them had stopped and asked, through the window, what I was making. My Vorok was functional for kitchen and supply interactions. I told them. Grain porridge with koi paste, sourdough bread, a dried fruit condiment I made because I had the ingredients and it kept well. They looked at the food with the expression of people confronting something their categorization system doesn't immediately know what to do with. Then they went to their duties. By week 6, they came back and brought a colleague. I fed them without comment. Pressenthal had assessed my food as decorative. These were decorative meals then. No nutritive intake happening here, just texture compounds and its aromatic profiles registering as novel. I kept cooking, and they kept coming, and the line got longer. And I sent a supplies reallocation request to the quartermaster. More grain, more dried legumes, more of the dried fruit that I'd begun to run through at a rate I hadn't planned for. And the quartermaster approved it without question, which I took as either administrative efficiency or a polite signal that nobody at the supply level was going to ask Horn too many questions about why the human cook needed more flour. Tem was good with the lines. He was young and occasionally unsure of himself in the way that 24-year-olds sometimes are when they're a long way from home and surrounded by people who are clearly not going to make it easy. But he was steady at the work. He had the cook's instinct for reading a service, knowing when the line was moving well, knowing when to add a ladle rather than wait to be asked, knowing when someone had been standing long enough that you should just hand them something without making them repeat themselves. It's not a taught skill exactly, it's a quality of attention. He had it. The Vorok who came through the line didn't say much to either of us. They pointed, or they indicated by gesture, or Pressenthal's initial audit participants repeated the names of things they'd tried during the sampling period. One crew member, a sensor technician whose name translated to something I rendered as Val in my head because the full Vorok name took about 4 syllables longer than I could reliably reproduce, started coming through twice per service, not for double portions. She'd take her tray, eat, bring the tray back, and then stand at the window for a minute or two before leaving. She wasn't asking for anything. She was just standing there. I didn't ask about it. Some people need a few minutes to decompress after eating. That's true across most species I've encountered. I let her stand there. Eventually she'd go. Around week 8, she started talking, slowly, with vocabulary that was clearly constructed from whatever standard she'd learned for functional ship operations, not for conversation. She asked how the fermentation worked. I explained it as simply as I could. She listened with the focused, slightly tilted attention of a sensor technician encountering a system she hasn't cataloged yet, asking clarifying questions that were actually specific and smart rather than polite placeholders. She came back the next day and asked a follow-up question about the koi spore activation process that suggested she'd thought about it overnight. I answered. We kept our exchanges to the service window, a few minutes at a time. It wasn't a friendship. It was closer to the careful, Respectful exchange you get between professionals in adjacent fields who have discovered they are interested in the same problem from different directions. By week 10, she'd started bringing a notebook. A Vorak-style data tablet, I mean. But she used it the way I used paper, to take notes she could look at later, not to process through a system. She was, I think, building a model, what the fermentation did and why it produced what it produced. I don't know if she ever finished it. She was reassigned to a different watch schedule in week 12, and I didn't see her at the window after that. The audit happened in week 11. I knew it was coming. Pressenthal had mentioned it in passing a few weeks earlier, as part of her quarterly reporting requirements, but I hadn't given it much thought. I had nothing to hide. I ran a clean galley. I kept my manifest current. My cultures were cleared on my boarding documentation. I'd flagged them properly as food production materials, and the exchange coordinator's office had signed off without issue. Pressenthal arrived at 0800 with 2 colleagues, both higher ranked, judging by the additional silver ridging along their collar lines, and a diagnostic array I didn't recognize. It was a larger unit than her standard assessment tool, mounted on a rolling frame, with a series of sensor heads on articulated arms, the kind of equipment you bring when you're doing a thorough job. They spent 4 hours in the galley while I worked around them, which was mildly awkward but not unmanageable. I've cooked with inspectors present before. The important thing is not to treat their presence as a disruption to the work, because the work doesn't pause. They sampled everything. They ran the array over my stores, dried goods, refrigerated items, the shelf-stable packets from my human supply allocation. They ran it over the oven, which seemed to interest them briefly before they moved on. They spent a significant amount of time at the fermentation crocks, the sensor heads hovering close over the sealed lids and then over the opened contents when they asked me to unseal them, which I did. They took readings from the bread starter in its sealed container on the second shelf, running the array over it from multiple angles. They were thorough. I will say that for them, Vorak nutritional officers do not do a half-measure audit. At one point, the taller of the 2 colleagues said something to Pressenthal in Vorak that I didn't catch. My Vorak was functional for kitchen and supply conversations, but not for technical discussions at speed. And she replied at length. Her voice had a quality it hadn't had in week 3. Something careful in it. Considered. They left without saying anything to me directly. Pressenthal paused at the door, turned like she was going to say something, and then turned back and left. I plated up the evening service and didn't think about it. I made the Thursday bread. I kept the koi crocs on schedule, feeding and turning. I made a soup that I'd been refining since week 7. A grain-based thing with dried legumes and the koi paste as the backbone seasoning. That had become, without any particular intention on my part, one of the most requested items among the Vorak crew who came through the line, not because they needed it. Pressenthal had been very clear that they didn't need it. They came through the line, apparently, because the sensory experience registered as pleasant. Week 12, Pressenthal came back. No colleagues this time, no diagnostic array. She stood at the window and watched me work for about 5 minutes before she said anything. I didn't push it. I've cooked for enough people in enough situations to know when someone is working up to something. You don't rush it. You let them get there in their own time, and you keep your hands busy so they don't feel watched. I need to ask you some questions about your fermentation process, she said finally. Sure. The condiment, the one you apply to the protein dishes, the grain-based one, from the ceramic crocks. The koi paste, yes. She had her tablet out, but she wasn't looking at it. She was looking at me. You've been producing this aboard the vessel since your arrival? Since week 2. The starter culture came with me from the Aldgate Cross. I've been maintaining it continuously for about 9 years, give or take. Started it from a commercial spore kit in the Pilbara, and it's been running since. She wrote something. And the bread culture, the sealed container on the second shelf. Sordo starter. Same principle. It's a live culture that I maintain and use to leaven the bread. That one I've had for 6 years. Got it from a baker in Fremantle during an extended refit. You maintain live microbial cultures aboard a fleet vessel. Yes, flagged on my boarding manifest as food production materials. They were cleared by the exchange coordinator's office before I boarded. I have the clearance documentation if you need it. I have reviewed the documentation. She wrote something else. The manifest review noted them as food cultures and approved them on that basis. The coordinator's office does not routinely conduct spectral analysis of food cultures for secondary metabolite profiles. That screening it is not part of the standard intake protocol. I looked at her. Okay, I am explaining, she said carefully, because I want you to understand that what I am about to tell you was not foreseeable to you or to us. The protocol gap is on our side. All right. I finished what I was doing with the prep and gave her my full attention, which seemed to be what she needed. What is it? She set her tablet on the window ledge, screen up, and looked at it rather than at me for a moment. Then she looked at me. The compounds produced by your fermentation cultures, particularly the koi paste and the sourdough, include a range of secondary metabolites as a byproduct of the fermentation process. Flavor compounds, various acids, enzymes. This was consistent with our initial assessment. However, she stopped, picked up the tablet, put it back down. The diagnostic array we used in the week 11 audit has a wider spectral range than my standard assessment tool. It detected a compound that my initial assessment did not. What kind of compound? We do not have a standard name for it that is commonly used. In Vorak biochemistry, we refer to this class of molecule as integration bridge compounds. They are involved in certain neurochemical signaling processes. They are not common in food sources, Vorak food sources, which is why they are not part of our standard nutritional intake screening. The screens are calibrated to detect nutritive inputs and known toxins. This compound is neither by our standards. When my week 3 assessment found it, the instrument simply did not register it as significant. When your week 3 assessment found it, a very slight pause. Yes, it was present in the data. It was not flagged because the screening parameters did not include it as a category of interest. I was reviewing my week 3 dataset against the week 11 array results and identified the discrepancy. She met my eyes. I want to be accurate about this. The compound was present from the beginning. We simply did not see it. I let that sit for a moment. So what does it do? I asked. The integration bridge compound. Pressenthal had the look of a person reading from a report she has written very carefully and is now reading from very carefully. It integrates, she said. That is the function of this class of molecule in Vorak neurochemistry. They act as signaling bridges in certain communication pathways. In a Vorak physiological context, encountering this type of compound in food is not something our system has protocols for, because it doesn't happen. The compound is produced biologically inside the body, not ingested, but it is being ingested. From my food, yes. And in sufficient concentrations, repeated exposure causes it to become incorporated into those neurochemical pathways. The pathway calibrates around its presence. Functionally, it becomes part of the pathway's baseline operating state. She paused. The compound itself is not harmful. It does not damage the pathways. It does not produce any adverse physiological effects that we have identified. By every independent measure we have applied, it is biologically inert. But, I said, the incorporation into the pathway baseline means that removal of the compound from the system would require the pathway to recalibrate back to its pre-incorporation state, which is a process that takes time. And during that time, there is a measurable deficit in the pathway's function. The galley was quiet for a few seconds. I could hear the fermentation croaks, which is not something you can actually hear, but which I always felt like I could. How measurable? I asked. Significant enough to be classified, Pressenthal said. With the composure of someone who has been practicing saying something they wish they did not have to say, as a Category 2 operational concern under fleet health protocols. I knew enough Vorak fleet procedure by week 12 to know what Category 2 meant. Not dangerous, not medical emergency territory, but it was the category that triggered mandatory reporting to Fleet Command, mandatory review by the Nutritional Board, and mandatory continuation of the causative condition pending full medical clearance. How many crew members? I asked. 47 who have been regularly attending your service, plus 11 who attended the mandatory audit sampling during weeks 4 through 6. She stopped just briefly. 58 total, out of a crew of how many? 212 aboard this vessel, so approximately a quarter. Yes, I picked up the ladle I'd set down and went back to what I'd been doing. I've got a full service in 40 minutes. Was there anything else? Presanthal stood at the window for another few seconds. She had arrived with a clear plan. Notify the human galley cook of the audit outcomes. File the dietary redundancy recommendation. Move along. She had a filing system and a procedure and a professional obligation to both, and somewhere between the week 11 array results and this conversation, the plan had become considerably more complicated. I will need to formally notify you, she said, that per Fleet Health Protocol 7-19, the cessation of a food source implicated in a Category 2 integration event requires a minimum 12-week supervised withdrawal period and approval from the Fleet Nutritional Board. Meaning I keep cooking. Meaning you keep cooking. Yes. And the recommendation to reduce my galley allocation. A longer pause than any she'd given me before. I will be revising that recommendation. I nodded. The koi paste is in the dinner service tonight. The bread's on Thursday. She left. I want to be clear about something here, because I know how this kind of story gets told. I was not doing any of this deliberately. I was not running a scheme. I did not arrive on the contemplation of distant stars, with 9 years of sourdough starter and 11 years of koi culture as some kind of calculated plan. I brought them because they're how I cook. They've been how I cook since before I had any idea Vorak fleet exchange programs existed. A good fermentation culture is the kind of thing you carry everywhere once you've built one worth carrying, the same way a good cook carries a knife they trust. It is not a weapon. It is not a tactic. It is just a tool that has become part of how you work. I also wasn't surprised, though. Not in the way you might expect. When you've spent 20 years feeding people in difficult environments, road, crews in the middle of the Australian desert, survey teams on 3-year tenders in deep space, pub kitchens at 2 in the morning on a Friday, you develop a particular relationship with what food actually does. Not just the nutritional things. Not just the things that show up on a spectral analysis. You develop a relationship with all the other things. Food builds familiarity. Food builds expectation. A body fed well and consistently begins to organize around that feeding. Not in a dramatic way. Not in the way that shows up in toxicology screens. In the way that a person eating the same breakfast every morning for 3 years reaches for the same cup without thinking about it. In the way that a crew on a long deployment starts to navigate their shifts by when the galley opens. In the way that people who haven't been home in 6 months will sometimes stop in the middle of eating and go quiet for a moment because something in the food reminded them of something. Food does this. I've watched it happen in enough contexts and enough species. The Vorak were not the first non-human crew I'd cooked for. Just the most rigorous about documenting their response, to know that it is not specific to humans, not specific to any biology. It is just what happens when you feed living creatures well consistently over time. Presanthal had measured everything she knew to measure. She'd missed the thing she didn't know she was looking for. That's not negligence. That's just the edge of what your instruments were designed for. The week 13 meeting was in the ship's medical consultation room. 4 Vorak officers, Presanthal, her 2 audit colleagues from week 11, and a 4th I hadn't seen before. Fleet Nutritional Assessor Dave Rixon, introduced with her full title and rank designation, which was long. She had more silver ridging along her collar than anyone else I'd encountered on. the ship. She also had the contained, precise expression of a senior officer who has been handed a situation report she considers professionally undignified and has decided as a matter of character to handle it with complete composure. I sat across from them with a cup of tea I'd made in the galley before coming up. Nobody had offered me anything. I'd anticipated this. Davrickson opened by clarifying, in precise standard, that this meeting was not disciplinary in nature. I said I hadn't thought it was. She gave me a look, brief, calibrating, and then proceeded. She explained the biochemical situation at length, the integration bridge compound, the neurochemical pathway incorporation, the 58 crew members in the dependency window, the fleet health protocol requirements, the 12-week supervised withdrawal period and its operational implications for a vessel on a 7-month deployment with no scheduled port call for 4 months. I drank my tea and let her get through it without interrupting. Because the information was accurate and the explanation was competent, and interrupting a fleet nutritional assessor mid-briefing is the kind of thing that adds a note to your file without helping anything. "We have reviewed your boarding documentation," Davrickson said, when she reached the end of the biochemistry section. "Your fermentation cultures were declared and cleared, as you indicated to Officer Pressenthal. The clearance was granted on the basis of a food production classification. We are not suggesting you circumvented protocol. Good. We are noting that the exchange program's intake screening process did not account for this category of compound in incoming food cultures. That gap has been identified and will be corrected in future deployments." "Seems sensible." "Yes." She laid her tablet flat on the table. "The immediate situation is as follows. 58 crew members are currently in the integration dependency window. Fleet health protocol requires that the causative food source continue uninterrupted until the nutritional board completes a review and issues a withdrawal schedule. That review will take approximately 2 weeks. The withdrawal schedule, once issued, will be a minimum of 12 weeks. This means that your continued presence aboard this vessel and the uninterrupted continuation of your current food service is required by Fleet Health Protocol for a minimum period extending well past your originally scheduled departure date." "How far past?" "Your original departure was scheduled at the end of month 6. The withdrawal schedule would not be complete until month 8 at the earliest." She paused. "An extension of your secondment will need to be arranged with your originating vessel and the exchange program coordinator. We are prepared to initiate that communication on your behalf, if you are agreeable." "I'm agreeable." Another pause. Davrickson looked at Pressenthal briefly, with a look I couldn't fully read. Two people who have had a longer discussion about this in private, with an outcome they've agreed on, arriving at the moment where they have to say it aloud. "We also need," Davrickson said, "to formally request that the koi paste and the sourdough bread be included as fixed line items in the Vorok crew ration schedule for the duration of the withdrawal period, not as supplementary items, as required nutritional provisions. So you're putting them on the official manifest." "Yes." "As required items." "Yes." "The koi paste and the bread that your nutritional officer described to me as biochemically inert filler." There was a pause at the table. "Not uncomfortable, exactly. Precise." Davrickson met my eyes with the steadiness of someone who has decided that directness is the only professional option remaining. "The classification has been revised," she said. "I thought about this for a moment, not because I was undecided, but because I have sat across enough tables from enough people who have had to say something difficult to know that the right response is not to pounce on it. You let it land. You give it the weight it deserves. Then you move." "That's fine," I said. "I'll need a store's allocation increase. The koi takes 10 days to mature, and I'll need expanded batch production capacity to cover 58 additional crew members on the ration schedule. I'll write up the specific quantities and get that to Pressenthal by end of day. That will be arranged. I'd also like my galley assistant formally reinstated." He was reassigned to general cargo duties in week 8 when the allocation review was being discussed. His name is Tem. He's from the human exchange cohort. Davrickson looked at Presenthal. Presenthal held the look without flinching. That can be arranged, Davrickson said. Good, I stood up. I've got a lunch service in 50 minutes. Was there anything else? There wasn't. I walked back down to the galley and started on the bread. Thursday, on schedule. Tem found me at the prep counter that afternoon, standing in the doorway in his general cargo work gear with an expression of considerable confusion. They just reassigned me back, he said. Good. Change into your apron. I need someone to turn the koi crocs. He changed into his apron. He turned the crocs. He worked with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this exact task enough times to not need instruction, which was satisfying to see. He'd been a quick learner when we first set up together, and 6 weeks of shifting cargo hadn't cost him the kitchen instincts we'd built. After a while, he said, There's a rumor going around the human cohort that you did something. I cooked. That's what I said. They said no, something bigger than that. Len said, You've got half the ship hooked on your food somehow. He said it like it was either very good or very bad, and he couldn't decide which. Tell Len it's neither. Cut those fine. I pointed at the onions. He cut the onions. We worked through the afternoon prep in the way we'd always worked. Divided, parallel, the kitchen having its own logic that we'd both learned, and that made the space efficient when we were in it together. After a while, he said, What actually happened? The koi produces a compound that their bodies incorporated. They need it now for a while, until their biochemistry recalibrates. It's not harmful. It's just, it got into the system without anyone noticing, including me. He thought about this, methodical with the knife. So you didn't do it on purpose? No, but it worked out. In the sense that I keep my galley allocation and my job, yes. And they have to eat your food. For about 14 more weeks, then they taper off. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the careful neutrality of someone trying not to seem like they're enjoying something too much. Yeah, that's something. It's cooking, Tem. He didn't say anything else for a while, but I could tell he was thinking about it. Young people do this. They find the shape of a thing and they keep turning it over, looking for the angle that makes it mean what they want it to mean. I let him work. He didn't say anything else for a while, but I could tell he was thinking about it. Young people do this. They find the shape of a thing and they keep turning it over, looking for the angle that makes it mean what they want it to mean. I let him work. I thought about what Len had said. Half the ship hooked on your food. He'd meant it as a joke, or close enough to a joke that the difference was mainly about whether you squinted. And it was, on the surface, funny in the way that the niche comedy of someone else's miscalculation is always slightly funny when you're not the one who miscalculated. But that's not what had actually happened, and I had been thinking about this since the week 13 meeting, quietly, the way you think about things that matter without advertising that they matter. What had happened was this. I'd come aboard a ship where a competent, thorough officer had looked at everything I brought with me and concluded, accurately based on everything she knew, that it was irrelevant. She'd measured correctly, her instruments were good, her methodology was sound, and the conclusion was wrong. Not because anything she did was wrong, but because the thing that mattered was the thing that fell outside the category of things her instruments were designed to find. That gap, the space between what you can measure and what exists, is not a new problem. I'd run into it in the Pilbara when a crew chief told me the food budget was adequate because the calorie counts were fine and the crew was still losing productivity to fatigue and low morale. And when I started making the fermented condiments and the bread and the meals that took slightly longer to prepare, the productivity numbers came back. Not because I'd fixed the calories. The calories were already fine. Something else had been wrong, and something else had gotten fixed. The crew chief hadn't asked me what I'd changed. He'd just noted that the numbers improved. I'd run into it on the Aldgate Cross, when we were 3 months from port and a researcher named Callie started coming to the galley at odd hours, not for food, but just to sit in a room that smelled like something other than recycled air and machinery. She sat at the end of the counter and worked on her reports, and I made tea when it seemed like she needed it. And after a while, she told me she'd been having a hard time, and the galley was the only place on the ship that felt like somewhere rather than just somewhere to be. I'd run into it with Vale at the service window, asking about fermentation in her careful, specific way, building a model in her notebook. None of these were the integration bridge compound. None of them showed up on Presenthal's spectral array. They were the other part, the part that is real and measurable only in the aggregate, over time, in the way that a crew on a long deployment navigates its shifts by the galley schedule, and eats slightly faster when the food is bad and slightly slower when it's good, and accumulates those minutes into something that either holds together or doesn't. I am not a philosopher. I am a cook. But I have been a cook long enough to know that the food you can't measure is still food. What I didn't tell him, what I hadn't told Presenthal, or Davrickson, or anyone in the meeting, was the specific thing I'd noticed around week 7. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of thing that would have been noteworthy to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. But I pay close attention to the people I feed, because that's the job. Around week 7, the Vorak crew members who came through my line started lingering. Not long, not chatting or socializing. Vorak fleet crew on duty have a fairly direct relationship with meal services. You take your food, you consume your food, you return to your duties. That's not rudeness. That's just how they run. I'd gotten used to it. But around week 7, a pattern emerged. They'd pick up their tray, take it to a table, eat, and then, not always, not every crew member, but consistently enough to notice, they'd sit for a few extra minutes. Sometimes they'd be reviewing something on their personal display. Sometimes they'd just be sitting. One crew member, a technical engineer whose name I couldn't pronounce correctly, started coming early for the morning service, before it was formally open, and sitting with a cup of the grain-based drink I'd been making. I let him. It didn't cost me anything. I didn't say anything to Presenthal about this because it wasn't my business to say. I'm a cook, not a behavioral analyst. I just noticed it, filed it, kept it, but it was there. It had been there before the compound was identified, before any of the formal meetings or protocol requirements. The thing that food does, the settling, the homing signal quality of a meal made consistently and well, was already doing it. The compound was real, the biochemistry was real, but the compound was, in some sense, just the part that showed up on an instrument. The weeks after the meeting had a different quality to them. Presenthal still came by the window, but her expression had changed. The week 3 assessment face was gone. What replaced it was something I recognized from the people I'd watched learn to pay attention. A certain quality of looking that is more open and more effortful at the same time. She watched me cook with the expression of someone who has decided that a process they previously dismissed contains information they haven't accounted for. She started asking questions, not about the biochemistry. That, I think, she was working through with her own instruments and her own colleagues. She asked about the cooking, about the fermentation, about why I maintained a live culture rather than using a commercially produced analog. I told her the truth. A live culture evolves with the food it processes. A powder doesn't. A live culture that's been maintained for 9 years, fed consistently, kept at the right temperature and humidity, in contact with the specific flour and water of the environments it's passed through. It carries something that a powder can't replicate. I couldn't tell her precisely what it carried. I could tell her that the food it made was better, and that the difference was consistent, and that 9 years of consistent better was enough for me to trust it. She found this philosophically difficult. Vorak nutritional science is built on precision. Good instruments, rigorous methodology, reproducible results. The idea of trusting a process you cannot fully quantify. Not because the instruments are bad, but because the relevant information is distributed through years of accumulated interaction in ways that don't compress well into a measurement, was the kind of thing that required her to revise not just a report, but a habit of mind. She revised it, though. That was the thing about Pressenthal. She was genuinely rigorous, not just in the sense of following protocols, but in the deeper sense of being committed to accuracy over convenience. When the data told her something she hadn't expected, she didn't reinterpret the data to fit her expectation. She changed her expectation. A lot of people can't do that. It is, I've found, one of the more useful qualities a person can have, and rarer than you'd think. She started coming to the galley at times when there was no service scheduled, just to observe. She'd take the same position, standing, never sitting, the way she always positioned herself, just to one side of the prep area, and she would watch me work with the focused quality of someone running a process assessment. I let her. I've had people watch me cook for one reason or another my whole career, and it stopped bothering me sometime in the Pilbara, when the crew chief would occasionally stand in the kitchen tent doorway and observe the way he'd observe anything that was consuming his budget. You just do the work. That's the only professional response. She watched the koi process, the way I assessed the fermentation progress by color and smell before I touched it with any instrument, the way I adjusted the temperature based on what I felt in the room rather than what the thermometer said, the way I opened the crock and leaned over it and took in the smell and decided from that whether to let it go another day or start drawing it down. She watched me make bread, which takes longer than most cooking and involves more moments of judgment that I cannot fully explain to someone who hasn't done it for years. Whether the dough has been kneaded enough is a feel thing. Whether the proof has gone far enough is a look and poke thing. Whether the oven temperature is right, on a ship where the oven dial has never entirely matched its stated temperature, is something I know from standing near it with my hand in the general vicinity of the door. She asked questions throughout, and they were specific and smart. Not the questions of someone being professionally polite, but of someone genuinely trying to build an accurate model of what they were seeing. What determines when the koi is ready? How do you assess fermentation progress without a spectral tool? What happens to the sourdough culture if you miss a feeding? If the oven temperature is unreliable, how do you produce consistent results? I answered everything I could honestly answer. For some things, I didn't have an answer better than "it looks right," or "it smells like it's supposed to," which was professionally unsatisfying to her and professionally accurate for me. "You are describing a process," she said one afternoon, "that cannot be fully reproduced from your description of it." That's right. Because the relevant variables are distributed across a learning process that the culture itself has undergone over years, which cannot be transmitted as information, more or less. And because the evaluative criteria, "it looks right," "it smells correct," are themselves derived from years of experience that cannot be transmitted either. Yes, this is, she said, with the measured precision of a scientist identifying a phenomenon she has no existing category for, a significant methodological limitation. "It's also why the food tastes the way it does," I said. Both things are true at the same time. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the bread dough I'd been folding. Then, "You are aware that this means the process cannot be fully standardized." "I'm aware. You find that acceptable." "I find it inevitable," I said. "There are things you can standardize and things you can't, and the things you can't standardize still work. You just have to accept that they work in a different way." She asked if she could watch me make the bread from start to finish, which took about 3 hours with the proofing time included. She pulled a stool to the end of the counter and sat on it for the entire process, which was the first time I'd seen her sit in my galley. She had her tablet and she was making notes throughout, but she'd also stopped doing the thing where she held the tablet between herself and whatever she was observing. She just watched. I made the bread. I talked through what I was doing when it seemed useful. I left the silences as silences when there was nothing useful to say. When it came out of the oven, I tapped the crust once, listened to the knock, and set it on the rack to cool. "How did you know it was done?" she asked. "The sound, the weight, the smell through the oven door. You cannot specify those criteria more precisely." "No, but you are confident in the result." "Yes." She made a note. Then she said, "I have been thinking about the secondary report I mentioned. The qualitative dimensions of the fermentation process. I believe I have found a way to include them that is accurate to the data, without overstating conclusions that the data cannot support." What's the framing? I am framing it as a methodology gap identification. The current exchange program intake screening is designed to detect known nutritive compounds and known toxins. It is not designed to assess biological systems that produce relevant compounds through continuous adaptive processes. The case identified in this deployment represents a class of gap, not an individual error. She paused. I am also noting separately that the positive performance metrics recorded among the affected crew members exceed what the compound integration alone would predict. I am classifying that as an unresolved variable requiring further investigation. That seems accurate. It is accurate, she said. What it is not is complete. I do not have an explanation for the full magnitude of the performance effect. No, I said. You probably won't find one in the instruments. She looked at me steadily. I know, she said. I didn't perform for her. I just made bread. In week 16, 2 weeks before my originally scheduled departure, 12 weeks passed when Davrickson had confirmed the segment extension. A formal communication came through the fleet messaging system. I read it at the prep counter. It was long. Vorok formal communications tend to be. It covered the confirmed resolution of the Category 2 integration event. The 58 crew members had completed the supervised withdrawal schedule and were cleared by the fleet medical officer, neurochemical pathways recalibrated, no residual effects documented. It covered the completion of the protocol revision for exchange program intake screening. All future deployments would include expanded spectral analysis of food cultures, with the new screening parameters derived in part from the metabolite profile of my fermentation products. My cultures had, in a small way, helped rewrite the checklist. It covered the formal closing of the exchange program health file, the administrative steps for my secondment extension, the scheduling of my eventual return transport, and then the last section, which was shorter, and which Davrickson had clearly written herself rather than delegating to a staff officer. She wrote that the Fleet Nutritional Board had conducted a thorough review of the incident and had determined that the integration event, while unintended and outside the scope of the exchange program's original design, had produced no measurable harm to any crew member. She wrote that the board had also noted, in its internal review, that crew members attending the human galley service had logged statistically elevated performance metrics across several cognitive and operational measures during the period under review. The metrics could not be attributed solely to the integration bridge compound. They were more likely attributable to what she described, with notable care, as the cumulative effect of consistent, well-prepared nutritional provision under extended deployment conditions. She did not elaborate. She was a fleet nutritional assessor. Elaboration was not her instrument, but I knew what she meant. I'd watched it happen for 5 months. The settling, the crew member who arrived early for the grain drink, the tables that held people a few minutes longer than they needed to stay. The way Tem had said, it tastes like the whole trip. On the morning I packed up the galley, eating the last piece of bread with both hands on the way to the transport. Food doesn't just fill the body. It does other things that don't have names in any species' nutritional database. It has been doing those things for as long as there have been bodies to fill. Davrickson ended her communication with a formal expression of the Fleet Exchange Program's appreciation for my service. And then, in the last line, clearly written and not a stock phrase, we anticipate the revised intake protocols will allow future exchange deployments to Proceed with full situational awareness. Full situational awareness. I read that twice. It was the most precise thing she could have said. And also, and I don't think this was accidental, she was not a careless writer, slightly funny, in the dry way of someone who has examined the gap between what they thought they were measuring and what they were actually measuring, and decided the correct response was not embarrassment, but accuracy. I filed the message and went back to work. On my last morning aboard the contemplation of distant stars, Press and Thaw came to the galley while I was packing the fermentation crocks into their foam-padded transport cases. Not officially, no tablet, no formal purpose. Just standing in the doorway, the way people stand when they've decided to do something, they're not entirely sure how to begin. She watched me secure the cases for a while. I made an error in my week 3 assessment, she said finally. I categorized your food as nutritively irrelevant to Varrock crew. I was not wrong about what I measured. I was wrong in my assumption that I had measured everything that was relevant. Yeah, I said, that happens. Not to me, she said it simply, without defensiveness, just as a statement of professional fact. This class of error is not one I make. I am thorough. My instruments are current and calibrated. I followed correct procedure at every step. You did, and I still missed it. You still missed it. I agreed. Not because you were careless, because you didn't know to look for it. Nobody did. I secured the last catch on the foam case. If it's any comfort, I didn't know either. Not specifically. I just knew the food was good. She was quiet for a moment. You trusted a process you couldn't fully quantify. I trusted 9 years of results. That is, she said, a different epistemology than we use. Probably works for different things. Yes. She looked at the fermentation cases. Will the cultures survive the transit? They've survived worse. The sourdough did 11 years on the Aldgate Cross, 2 years in the Pilbara, and 6 weeks in the back of a van in Queensland in 40-degree heat. A fleet transport is nothing. Something in her expression shifted very slightly. Not quite a smile, because Vorak expressions don't work that way, but something in the same direction. The bread, she said. I would like a recipe. For my records, I found a piece of paper, actual paper, which I kept for lists and notes because screens are fine, but paper stays where you put it, and wrote out the recipe the way I'd learned it and the way I taught it, the ratios, the process, and then the notes that don't fit in a formula. The dough should feel tacky but not sticky. The oven should be hot enough that you wince when you open the door. The crust should sound hollow when you tap it. A clean knock, no dullness. The bread is done when it smells like it's done. She read it carefully. She had the look of someone encountering instructions that rely on sensory judgment and finding it simultaneously rigorous because the standards are real and impossible to fully transmit. The starter culture won't translate, she said. No, the one here is specific to this kitchen now. The flour I've been using, the ambient temperatures, the particular character of the water from your ship's processing system. You'd have to build a new one from scratch if you wanted to continue. How long? A few months to build one worth using. You feed it daily. Keep it warm. Give it time and don't rush it. I closed the last transport case. It learns what it needs to learn. You just have to let it do that on its own schedule. She folded the recipe and put it in her uniform pocket. There was something careful in how she did it. Not precious, but deliberate. The gesture of someone who intends to keep a thing. The program coordinator has formally noted your service record as exceptional, she said. I contributed a statement to that notation. I appreciate that. It is accurate. She straightened, back in the professional posture. Good journey, Farron. You too, I said. Tem was waiting at the corridor junction with both his bags and half a piece of bread going cold in his hand, which he'd clearly grabbed on the way out of the galley and hadn't finished yet. Ready? He asked. Ready. We went down to the transport bay. 47 crew members were on shift, 11 of them, I counted, not intentionally, just the way you count things you're in the habit of tracking, were from Pressenthal's original audit sampling list. They were doing their jobs. They didn't wave or acknowledge us in any particular way, Vorok fleet crew don't do departures like that. But Pressenthal was at the bay entrance when we came through, standing to one side, and she inclined her head at me in the Vorok gesture that I'd learned by week 2 meant something between acknowledgement and respect. A small, motion precise, the same gesture she gave senior officers. I nodded back. The transport docked and we boarded. The contemplation of distant stars fell away behind us in the dark, which is as dramatic as space departures get when you're on a transport without windows worth looking through. In the hold, my fermentation crocks were in their foam cases, doing whatever fermentation cultures do in transit, adapting, adjusting, continuing the slow biochemical work that they'd been doing for 9 years, without caring where they were or who was watching. They'd arrive at the next kitchen and they'd keep going. That's what they did. Tem was asleep before we'd cleared the docking corridor, slumped against his bags with the composure of a 24-year-old who can sleep anywhere. The last piece of bread was gone. I had a small notebook that I'd kept since the Aldgate Cross. I'd added Elaine's sourdough notes to it years ago, and notes on the Koi process, and a few things I'd figured out in the Pilbara that I didn't want to forget. I added a line for this deployment, a note about the integration bridge compound and what the expanded screening now covered. A note about Pressenthal, who had been wrong about something and changed her mind, which is the harder of the two skills and worth noting when you see it. Then I closed the notebook and sat with the quiet that comes after a long deployment is done. Not empty, not restless, just the particular stillness of having completed something. I'm not a complicated man. I know how to feed people. I know how to manage a manifest. I know how to stay out of the way. As it turns out, I also know how to get on to the official ration schedule of a Vorok fleet vessel by accident. Without trying, through the medium of 9-year-old Koi paste, Enbred made the way a baker in Fremantle taught me a decade ago. Nobody expected the cook to be the problem. I'm still not sure I was. I just know the bread was good.